Before we get started, there's two things that you need to remember when painting something glowing. The first thing is that the object you're painting is going to be the brightest in the middle and it will get darker as you move outward. And the second thing is that the color temperature is going to be the coolest in the middle and it will get warmer as it moves outward. That's it. Let's get into the painting. In this video, I'm going to show you 3 different techniques I use to create glowing effects. The first one is wet on wet. I start out by wetting the paper with clean water. Make sure you use a lot of water in this step and also spread them out evenly so there's no puddle in a specific area. Then starting out with white, I'm going to add this in the middle of our light source. And as I move outward, I'm going to make it warmer by adding yellow, starting with lemon yellow because it's a cooler yellow, and then slowly making it warmer by adding cadmium yellow and cadmium red. Because we wet the paper beforehand, you will notice that it will be a lot easier for you to blend everything in and get a smooth transition between this color without having any hard edges. Also make sure to use paper that can handle a lot of water. I generally use at least 300 GSM watercolor paper. If you use a lower graded paper, it may deteriorate when you add a lot of water. After having the main color down, I'm going back in with a bright yellow to blend everything in with each other. And there we have the first glowing effect. Pretty simple, right? So when should we use this technique? I like using this wet on wet technique mostly for the sun, when I know I need to create a glowing sunset or sunrise that need to be blended with the color of the sky and everything around it. And to demonstrate that, here I'm painting a sunset scene where we'll have our sun glowing in the background and we'll have some silhouette of plants in the foreground. Just like what I did previously in the left hand side, for this particular painting I started out by wetting the whole area that I know I'm gonna paint, and then I slowly going from the middle where the lightest part is, which I use white for, and then as I move outward I'm adding more yellow and more cadmium red to make it warmer. After that, I'm adding in the blue color of the sky. Make sure that the blue you mix is slightly lighter and also desaturated so that it blends in with the warm orange and yellow better. After putting that blue down, now we're mixing that orange color again and going over the top part to try and blend everything in. Again, you find it a lot easier to blend them in when everything is still wet. If you wait for your paint to dry, it's going to be a tough time making sure that there are no hard edges on your sky. After we have that top part of the sky down, now I'm mixing a darker red to go in and paint in the shadow bottom part of all the plants. We want to work quickly here because I want to put this down while the top part hasn't completely dried, and therefore create kind of like a fuzzy, blurry transition between the plant and the sky. And I'm going to make the mixture darker as I get to the bottom of the painting. Here I'm using the same dark mixture to paint in the plant silhouettes. The plants at the bottom and on the side will be darker, and as we go more toward the middle where it's closer to the sun, you will see that I'm going to mix a more orange reddish color to paint some of the warmer and lighter plants. And here's our first quick painting. For the second technique, we're doing wet on dry, so your paper could be slightly lower graded. About 200 GSM would do. Just like the first technique, I'm starting out by adding white into the middle part where the lightest light source is going to be. Then as I move outward, I slowly adding more yellow and more red to make it warmer. The only difference here is that I didn't add any water beforehand. With this, our color transition is a little bit rougher, it's not as smooth as the previous method. And the key to overcome this problem is to work very quickly. After I put down the initial light and dark area, you will see me going over the same area again while the paints are still wet to help blend in some of the hard edges. Remember with gouache, if you want your next layer to stay opaque and separate from your previous layer, you want to wait for everything to dry first. What we're trying to do here is the opposite of that. I'm putting down multiple layers on top of each other while the previous layer hasn't dried yet, because I know the paint will blend themselves in for me. A very important thing to know when using this technique is that because we're depending on our thick and wet paint mixture to blend in with each other, we want to keep the colors analogous to each other. As in right now, I'm going from yellow to orange to red, which are all analogous colors. If I were to try and add some blue colors onto this painting right now, it would make everything look super muddy and ugly because blue is the complementary color of orange. The reason why we could do it in the first technique is because the amount of clean water we have in the painting and the paper is a lot more. We wetted the whole area with several layers of clean water, and that would help blend everything in, whereas right now the only water that we have is the one we used to mix the pans with. So you may be wondering, why would I use this technique instead of the first one? I like using this for painting lamps and lanterns, essentially any light source that doesn't need to blend in with the background. Here I'm painting 3 different lanterns right next to each other, and after that I'm going to add a dark background surrounded all 3 of them without worrying that the dark color would actually blend in and blur in with each of the lanterns, because we're using wet on dry, and thus we have more control over the water and which area we want to blend in and which we don't want to. And here's our second painting. So for our third technique, I'm going to add in the background color first. Now to create the glowing effect on top of this dark background, I'm using a clean wet brush to take some of the paints off on the area where I want the light to be. After that, I wipe off the extra paints on my brush with some paper towel and then repeat the process until I get a relatively light area in the middle of that dark background. Now, just like what we did previously, I'm starting out with white in the middle of this area and making it slightly warmer as I go outward. You will see that it's feel a lot similar to the first technique, but it is very contained within that small area. You will have a little bit of a blurry edge from the light source to the background, but you don't have to worry about everything getting smooshed together. I like using this technique when my glowing lights are very small compared to everything else. This usually happens when I want to paint fireflies or cars' taillights in a very big city scene. Typically in these types of paintings, the glowing lights are the last thing that I would paint. For example, in this one, I'm painting a forest scene with some fireflies. I start out by putting the background color where the top part is kind of like a blue for the forest and the bottom is going to be green for the grass. Then I use a dark color to add in all the trees in the background. Since this is a quick sketch, we're not going into too much detail. I'm just adding some trees and leaves on the top part to indicate the scenery where this painting is set at, which is a forest. After I finish with everything else, the last part is to adding those fireflies by using a wet brush to take off the paints in the area where I want my fireflies to appear. Because these are really small, I'm actually starting out with a yellow color first, filling in all of these dots with this yellow color, and then afterwards I'm going to use white to add a even smaller dot in the center of each of these glowing fireflies. For the really teeny one, you don't really need to take off the paint first because it's pretty much just a dot. It doesn't really matter if the edges around that dot and the background are blurry or hard edges. We're just going to use some thick white paint to indicate those tiny dots around the bigger fireflies that we add using this third technique. And that is our third painting. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and I will see you in the next one.